A man's flight is turned upside down when a so-called VIP tries to take his seat. But what they don't know is that the man they're trying to push aside is the CEO of the company that runs the airline's entire IT system. Ever been told to move so someone more important can have your spot? This man's response made an entire airline regret it. The first time I saw him, he didn't look like someone who was about to make headlines. He was just another passenger at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport that Wednesday afternoon, wearing a tailored navy blazer over a simple gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and well-polished loafers. His name was Elias Thorne, 47 years old, founder and CEO of Thorne Dynamics, a software company that supplied complex IT solutions for several major corporations, one of them being a well-known national airline. He had just closed one of the biggest contracts of his career in Phoenix the day before and was heading back to his headquarters in San Diego. For him, this flight wasn't just a ride home. It was a chance to take a breath, finally enjoy the quiet, and maybe even order a bourbon before takeoff. He carried no entourage, no assistant shuffling papers behind him, just his sleek black carry-on and a leather briefcase tucked under his arm. The terminal was noisy, but Elias wasn't. He had a way of moving through spaces without drawing unnecessary attention, something he'd learned early in his career when people often underestimated him before realizing who he was. A few travelers gave him casual glances, the kind people give strangers they think they might recognize from somewhere but aren't quite sure. When boarding was called for first class, Elias was among the first to stand. He walked up to the gate calmly, scanned his ticket, and stepped down the jet bridge towards seat 1A, his favorite. It wasn't just for the extra legroom or the priority service. It was the spot he'd sat in countless times when flying for business. For him, that seat meant consistency in a life where very little was. As he settled in, Elias glanced around. The cabin smelled faintly of citrus cleaner, and the leather headrest felt cool under his hand. He tucked his briefcase under the seat in front of him and slid his phone into the side pocket. He wasn't expecting anything unusual. He'd done this routine hundreds of times before. But comfort, as he was about to be reminded, can be deceiving. 2 rows behind him, a younger man in his late 20s, tall and sandy-haired, entered with a confident swagger. He was dressed in a pale blue button-down, sleeves rolled up, and designer sunglasses pushed up on his head. Elias barely noticed him at first, but in just a few minutes, that man would become the center of an interaction Elias couldn't ignore and wouldn't soon forget. The cabin crew was finishing pre-boarding checks when Elias heard the sound of measured footsteps approaching. He looked up to see a flight attendant, petite with sharp features, stopping at his row. Her tone was polite, but her words were wrapped in an awkward tightness. "Mr. Thorne," she began, glancing briefly over her shoulder. "We're going to need you to switch seats for a moment. There's been a mix-up, and another passenger was assigned to this seat." Elias blinked, surprised. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat. It's on my boarding pass." She nodded quickly. "I understand, sir, but this gentleman," she gestured subtly to the younger man now standing near the galley, "was supposed to have this seat reserved." Elias's brows drew together. Reserved? He knew how airline seating worked. There was no such thing as a VIP reservation that could override a confirmed first-class ticket at the last minute. At least not without a very unusual reason. Still, something in her voice told him this wasn't about a clerical error. But whatever it was about to push this quiet trip into unfamiliar territory. Elias stayed in his seat, his back straight, but his voice even. "I booked this weeks ago. First class, seat 1A. I don't understand why I'd have to move now." The flight attendant shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her eyes darted briefly to the young man who was leaning casually against the wall near the galley, arms folded like he had all the time in the world. "It's just, he's a frequent VIP flyer with our airline," she said softly, almost apologetically. "It would make things easier for us if you could take another seat for this trip." Elias could feel the subtle shift in the cabin around him. A few other passengers in first class were now watching, pretending not to listen, but clearly following every word. It wasn't loud, but there was a current of curiosity moving through the air. He turned his head and finally looked at the man they were asking him to move for. The guy was smirking slightly, like this was all a mild inconvenience for him, but also something he expected to go his way. He didn't offer an introduction, didn't speak up to say, "It's no big deal." He just stared back at Elias as though waiting to see if he'd comply. Elias's voice remained calm. "And where would you put me?" The flight attendant hesitated. "Seat 3C. It's still first class, just a few rows back." A few rows back didn't matter to Elias in terms of service. It mattered because he knew exactly what this was about. The man behind him didn't want seat 1A because it was better. He wanted it because it was his symbol of priority. And right now the crew seemed willing to shuffle him aside to accommodate that. He opened his mouth to respond, but just then another passenger, an older woman seated across the aisle, spoke up. Why should he move? He's already sitting where he belongs. Her voice was firm, with the kind of authority that makes people pause. The flight attendant's lips tightened, but she didn't reply to the woman. Instead, she looked back at Elias, waiting. In that moment, Elias thought about the last 20 years, about the times he'd been mistaken for someone's assistant instead of the owner, about the networking dinners where people ignored him until they realized his name was on the contract. He'd learned to choose his battles, but he'd also learned that some moments defined more than just the next hour. They defined who you were to yourself. "I'm not moving," he said finally, his tone calm but unshakable. The flight attendant gave a tight nod and walked toward the galley. Elias could hear muffled voices, hers and another crew member's, before she returned with a clipped smile. "All right, Mr. Thorne," she said. "We'll see what we can do." She walked away again, but this time the younger man's expression had shifted from confident to slightly irritated. The rest of the passengers resumed their own small conversations, but Elias knew this wasn't over. Something told him the crew wasn't finished trying to get him out of that seat. But what he didn't realize yet was how public and humiliating their next attempt would be. The boarding process dragged on, and Elias could feel the tension creeping back into the cabin. Passengers were settling in, tucking bags away, and flipping through safety cards. But every now and then he caught the younger man glancing his way, like someone watching a chessboard waiting for the next move. It came faster than Elias expected. The same flight attendant returned, this time with another crew member, taller with a brisk, no-nonsense demeanor. The taller one leaned slightly toward Elias's row. "Mr. Thorne," he began, "I'm afraid there's been a seating miscommunication. We really need you to relocate so this passenger can take his assigned spot. It's important to our operations today." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Important to your operations, or important to him?" His voice was steady, not raised, but enough for nearby passengers to glance up again. The younger man finally stepped forward, offering a thin smile. "Listen, man. I fly with this airline every week. Seat 1A is my spot. It's nothing personal." Elias turned to him. Nothing personal is exactly what it becomes when you expect someone else to give up a seat they paid for just because you want it. The air between them thickened. The flight attendant interjected quickly. "Gentlemen, please. We can resolve this without." "Without what?" The older woman across the aisle cut in again, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Without making a scene? This is a scene, and it's not in making it." A man in the second row nodded in agreement. "The ticket decides the seat. End of story." Elias could see the crew exchange a quick, uneasy glance. They clearly hadn't expected passengers to speak up, but instead of backing off, the taller attendant's tone became firmer. "If you don't cooperate, sir, we may have to delay departure." Elias leaned back in his seat, eyes steady. "If that's what it takes, then I guess we're delaying." "I'm not moving." A few people muttered quietly, some annoyed at the delay, others clearly siding with him. The younger man's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, pulling out his phone as if to distract himself. The crew walked away again, and Elias exhaled slowly. He'd stood his ground, but he knew it wasn't over. This kind of standoff didn't just fizzle out. Minutes later, an announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're finalizing our seating arrangements, and we'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." Elias caught the words seating arrangements like a warning bell. He knew they were still trying to maneuver behind the scenes, but he had no idea the next move would involve turning the entire cabin's attention on him. The aisle was almost clear now, only a few passengers still shuffling to their seats. Elias had just opened a folder from his briefcase when he saw two figures returning, the same tall flight attendant from earlier, now joined by a uniformed ground supervisor. The supervisor's polished badge caught the overhead light, and his smile was the kind people wear when they're trying to be pleasant while delivering bad news. "Mr. Thorne," the supervisor said in a voice loud enough for the front of the cabin to hear. "We're going to have to ask you one last time to move to another seat so we can accommodate our elite member." Several passengers looked up immediately. This wasn't quiet anymore. They were broadcasting the confrontation for everyone to witness. Elias set his folder down. "And I'm going to have to tell you again. I'm not moving. I have a confirmed seat and I boarded according to my ticket." The supervisor glanced toward the young man still standing in the galley area, then back to Elias. "Sir, refusing to comply with crew instructions can result in removal from the aircraft." Elias felt heat rise in his chest, not from fear, but from the way those words were designed to pressure him in public. It was a tactic, to force someone to back down by making them feel like the problem. From across the aisle, the older woman's voice cut through again. "This is absurd. You can't just bump a paying passenger because someone else wants his seat." Now, murmurs spread through first class. A man 2 rows back spoke up. "Yeah, that's not how it works. This is wrong." Elias noticed the younger man shift uncomfortably, his smirk fading, but the supervisor wasn't letting up. "We're asking for cooperation so we can depart on time. If you'd like, I can walk you to the gate desk to discuss it." Elias met his gaze. "So, you're offering to remove me from my paid seat to have a conversation about why I should give it to someone else. Is that right?" The supervisor didn't answer directly. "Sir, it would be best if we could handle this without further disruption." Elias leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, but making sure it carried enough for nearby passengers to hear. "The only disruption is you standing here asking me to give up something I rightfully purchased. If this were really about a clerical error, you'd be asking him to move, not me." The silence that followed was heavy. Passengers stared between them, waiting to see who would blink first. Finally, the supervisor's smile thinned. "Very well. Stay in your seat. We'll make alternate arrangements." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the galley, the tall attendant following close behind. Elias leaned back again, but his muscles stayed tight. He could feel every glance in the cabin, some supportive, some curious, some irritated that the flight was taking longer to push back. For the rest of taxiing and takeoff, he kept his focus out the window, not on the man sitting just a few rows back, who clearly didn't get what he wanted. But Elias also didn't realize how deep the sting would run after the flight, and how quickly that quiet anger would harden into something much bigger. The plane touched down in San Diego just after sunset. Elias waited for the crowd to thin before grabbing his carry-on from the overhead bin. The younger man avoided eye contact as Elias stepped into the aisle. He could feel the older woman across the aisle giving him a small nod, her way of saying, "You did the right thing." But the right thing didn't feel good right now. The encounter had left a mark, not just because of what happened, but because of how it happened, publicly, deliberately, and with the assumption that he would bend. Walking through the terminal, Elias replayed every moment. The way the flight attendant had avoided looking him directly in the eye when she first asked him to move. The thinly veiled "important to our operations" excuse. The smirk on the younger man's face. The supervisor's public threat to remove him from the plane. It all stacked up like evidence in a case he hadn't asked to fight. By the time he stepped into his black sedan outside the airport, the city lights were blinking across the bay. His driver, a middle-aged man with a warm smile, asked if the flight had gone smoothly. Elias just said, "We made it," and left it at that. At home, he dropped his briefcase on the kitchen island and poured himself a glass of water. His phone was already buzzing with emails from his executive team about the Phoenix deal. Normally, that would have lifted his mood. Tonight, it didn't. Instead, he sat in the quiet kitchen, staring at the glass in his hand. He thought about how many times in his career he'd brushed off similar moments in the name of keeping the peace. But this time, the sting wasn't fading, it was sharpening. The airline didn't know that Thorne Dynamics wasn't just another vendor. They were a key supplier of the airline's internal software systems. Everything from scheduling to maintenance logs ran through platforms his company designed. And with the Phoenix deal wrapped, his schedule for the next few days was unusually open. He picked up his phone and called his COO, David, who answered on the second ring. "You're still at the office?" Elias asked. "Yeah, just finishing up the Phoenix reports." "What's up?" Elias's tone was calm, almost casual. "I need you to pull up the contracts we have with AtlasAir. I want the full scope, terms, renewal dates, everything." David paused. "Sure, but why?" "I'll explain tomorrow," Elias said. "Let's meet first thing." After hanging up, Elias leaned back in his chair. For the first time that evening, his thoughts weren't just circling around what happened. They were moving toward what could happen next. But the plan forming in his mind wasn't about revenge for one bad flight. It was about making sure the people who thought they could treat him like that learned exactly who they were dealing with. Elias arrived at the office earlier than usual. The San Diego skyline was still tinted with the soft gold of sunrise as he stepped into the glass-front building that housed Thorne Dynamics headquarters. The security guard greeted him warmly, and Elias returned the nod, his mind already locked on what he was about to set in motion. David was waiting in the conference room with a stack of printed documents and his laptop open. "I pulled everything," he said. "Our main contract with AtlasAir runs through the end of the year. Renewal discussions are scheduled for August. We provide their flight scheduling, maintenance tracking, crew management. Basically, if our systems went offline, they'd be in chaos within hours." Elias sat at the head of the table, flipping through the pages. "And how many other companies do we have lined up who'd take this exact package if we pulled it from AtlasAir?" David smirked faintly. "3 at least. 2 of them are their direct competitors." Elias closed the folder. "Then we're going to start those conversations today, quietly. I want AtlasAir at the bottom of our priority list. No more extras, no fast-track support, no special treatment. They treated me like a nuisance on my own ticket. Let's see how they handle being a nuisance in their own operations." David's eyebrows rose. "This is about what happened on your flight." Elias leaned back. "It's about respect. They made a decision to publicly push me aside for someone they valued more. Not because of money, not because of status, but because they thought they could. I want them to know that the seat they took from me yesterday might be the most expensive seat they've ever moved." David nodded slowly. "You want me to give them a heads up?" "No," Elias said firmly. "Let it hit them when it counts." For the rest of the morning, Elias and his senior team reviewed every touchpoint the airline had with Thorne Dynamics. They mapped out exactly how to shift their resources toward other clients, all without breaking the terms of their current contract. It wasn't vindictive, it was strategic. By noon, calls were already being made to 2 rival airlines, both of which were eager to hear how quickly Thorne Dynamics could tailor their systems to fit their needs. Elias didn't rush the pitch. He wanted this move to feel inevitable, not reactive. As he left the conference room, David called after him, "You sure you don't want to just call AtlasAir and tell them why you're doing this?" Elias paused at the door, a faint smile playing at the edge of his mouth. "They'll figure it out, and when they do, I want them to remember that it could have been avoided with 2 simple words, enjoy your flight." But what Elias didn't expect was how fast the consequences would start showing and how much panic it would cause inside AtlasAir's headquarters. It started 3 days later. Elias was in his office reviewing the Phoenix contract when David walked in, holding his phone out. "You'll want to hear this," he said, hitting the speaker button. On the line was a contact from one of AtlasAir's regional offices speaking in a hurried tone. "We've got a backlog in scheduling. The system's running slower than normal, and our support requests aren't being prioritized like they used to. We've got flights at risk of delay." David gave Elias a look. Elias simply leaned back in his chair, letting the man on the phone continue. By the end of the week, the calls were coming directly from AtlasAir's corporate office. Their operations director was trying to sound composed, but the strain was obvious. "Mr. Thorne, we've noticed a shift in the service level we're receiving from your team. Is there something we should be aware of?" Elias's reply was calm, deliberate. "Your service level is exactly what our contract specifies. Nothing more, nothing less." There was a pause on the other end. "Then we'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss an extension. We're prepared to make adjustments to the current terms." Elias cut in, his voice steady. "I'm already in talks with other carriers. We'll fulfill our agreement with you, but beyond that, I think our priorities are better aligned elsewhere." It was polite, professional, and final. 2 weeks later, word was circulating in the industry: Thorne Dynamics was shifting its resources to competitors. AtlasAir wasn't collapsing, but their operations were strained, their reputation taking subtle but noticeable hits, the kind of damage that lingers. One afternoon, Elias received a letter, not from their corporate office, but from the CEO himself. It was short, acknowledging an incident on one of their flights, apologizing for any misunderstanding and expressing hope they could rebuild the business relationship. Elias read it once, then set it aside. An apology sent weeks later, only after feeling the consequences, wasn't the same as the one that should have been given in the moment. That night, over dinner with a close friend, Elias summed it up. "People think disrespect is a moment, a small thing you can brush past, but sometimes it's the moment that decides how the next chapter of your story is written, for you and for them." The friend nodded. "So, you're not going back?" Elias smiled faintly. "Not unless they buy a ticket to my flight, seat 1A. The moral of this story is simple: respect is not about position, status, or titles. It's about how you treat someone when you think no one is watching. The smallest choices can cost the most, and sometimes the price doesn't show up until it's far too late to fix." If you've ever been in Elias's shoes, overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside, remember, you have more power than you think. Use it wisely. Stand your ground when it matters and never let someone decide your worth for you, because sometimes the quietest seat on the plane can turn out to be the loudest statement you ever make.